Welcome to Horror Midnight Thrills. Thank you for stopping by to watch our spine-chilling, heart-pounding, scary videos. Your support means the world to us. If you love thrilling tales and terrifying mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. It was an old Victorian house, perched at the edge of the town of Ravenswood, known for its eerie past and chilling whispers of ghostly tales. The house had been converted into a paying guest accommodation by Mrs. Hawthorne, a stern woman in her 60s who lived in the basement. Despite its ominous reputation, the house was always full, as Mrs. Hawthorne offered cheap rent to those willing to overlook the creaks and groans of the ancient structure. Amira, a young woman who had just moved to the town for her new job, was one such tenant. She found the house charming in a peculiar way, with its vintage decor and vast, overgrown garden. Mrs. Hawthorne was kind enough, though her presence was unsettling. There was something about her piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. Amira settled into her room on the second floor, a cozy space with a large window overlooking the garden. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the occasional sounds of footsteps in the corridor outside her room. She assumed it was the other tenants, though she never saw anyone leave their rooms at night. One evening, as she was returning from work, Mrs. Hawthorne stopped her in the hallway. "Stay inside your room tonight," she warned, her voice grave. "Whatever you hear, do not leave your room." Amira laughed nervously. "Is there a reason?" Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes bored into hers. "Just trust me." That night, Amira locked her door and tried to sleep. Around midnight, she was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. She sat up, her heart racing as the scream was followed by frantic pounding on the door. "Help! Please, let me in." The voice was desperate, pleading. It sounded like one of the other tenants, a young woman named Sarah. Ignoring Mrs. Hawthorne's warning, Amira rushed to the door and opened it. The corridor was empty, and the only sound was the howling wind outside. She stepped out, calling for Sarah, but there was no answer. The house seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing down on her. She decided to check Sarah's room. As she approached the door, she saw it was ajar. Pushing it open, she was met with a sight that sent chills down her spine. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned, and on the floor, a pool of blood. There was no sign of Sarah. Terrified, Amira backed out of the room and ran back to her own, locking the door behind her. The next morning, she confronted Mrs. Hawthorne. "What happened to Sarah?" she demanded. Mrs. Hawthorne looked at her with those unnerving blue eyes. "There's no one named Sarah living here, dear." Amira was stunned. "But I heard her. I saw the blood." "Sometimes this house has a way of playing tricks on the mind," Mrs. Hawthorne said cryptically. "You mustn't let it get to you." Determined to uncover the truth, Amira began researching the house's history. She discovered that it had once belonged to a family who mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The townsfolk whispered that the house was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had lived there. One night, she decided to investigate further. She waited until everyone was asleep and crept downstairs to the basement where Mrs. Hawthorne stayed. The door was unlocked and she descended into the dimly lit space, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes. She found a locked door at the far end and, using a hairpin, managed to unlock it. Inside, she discovered a small, hidden room. The walls were covered with old photographs, all of young women. Her heart pounded as she recognized some of them as former tenants who had mysteriously vanished. In the center of the room was an altar, adorned with candles and strange symbols. Amira realized with horror that Mrs. Hawthorne was performing some kind of dark ritual. Just then, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly hid behind a stack of boxes, peering through a gap. Mrs. Hawthorne entered the room, a sinister smile on her face. She began to chant in a language Amira didn't understand, and the room grew colder. Shadows seemed to gather around the altar, and a sense of dread filled the air. Amira's mind raced as she realized the truth. Mrs. Hawthorne was summoning the spirits of the house, using the tenants as sacrifices. Terrified, Amira tried to retreat silently, but she knocked over a box, causing a loud crash. Mrs. Hawthorne's head snapped in her direction, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, advancing towards Amira. Amira bolted for the stairs, but the shadows seemed to come alive, grabbing at her and pulling her back. She struggled, her screams echoing through the basement, but Mrs. Hawthorne's grip was cold and relentless. "You'll make a fine addition to my collection," she said with a chilling smile. As Amira felt the life drained from her, she realized too late the full horror of the house. It wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, a place where the living and the dead were bound together by dark magic. Months later, a new tenant moved into the house, lured by the promise of cheap rent. And on their first night, they heard a soft, desperate whisper in the corridor outside their room. "Help, please." The office of Bracken and Finch, a prestigious law firm, was a hive of activity during the day. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a different aura enveloped the place. The corridors, once bustling with lawyers and paralegals, now stood silent and eerie, casting long shadows under the flickering fluorescent lights. James, the night guard, had worked the night shift for years. He knew every creak of the old building, every whisper of the air conditioning system. But recently something felt off. It started with small things. Documents scattered across desks, chairs moved from their usual places, the faint sound of typing in the empty office. James chalked it up to exhaustion until one night, the inexplicable began to escalate. It was a rainy Tuesday. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the sound of raindrops pelting the windows added to the unsettling atmosphere. James made his rounds, flashlight in hand, checking each office room. As he approached the conference room, he heard it, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the door handle. The room was dark, save for the dim emergency light casting eerie shadows. He aimed his flashlight, illuminating the long table. Empty. Just as he was about to leave, he saw it, a single fresh handprint on the polished wood, still wet. James's mind raced. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the handprint remained. Just then the lights flickered and the air grew colder. A whisper echoed through the room, a faint, unintelligible murmur that sent shivers down his spine. He turned quickly, convinced he saw a shadow move in the corner of his eye. Deciding he'd had enough, James hurried back to the security office, locking the door behind him. He watched the CCTV monitors, hoping to catch sight of whatever was causing these disturbances. Midnight approached, and the building seemed to groan and breathe with a life of its own. The monitors flickered, and then he saw it, a figure standing in the hallway outside the CEO's office. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, and facing the camera, its face obscured. James's hand shook as he reached for the intercom. "Who are you? Identify yourself." His voice echoed through the empty halls, but the figure remained unmoved. Suddenly the screen went black. The power cut out, plunging the building into darkness. Moments later, the emergency lights flickered on. James's skin prickled with fear. He grabbed his flashlight and headed towards the CEO's office. As he got closer, the air grew colder, each breath visible in the frigid air. The door to the office was ajar, and he could hear the rustling of papers inside. With every step, the sense of dread grew stronger. He pushed the door open with trembling hands and shone his flashlight into the room. The sight before him made his blood run cold. Papers and files were scattered everywhere, and in the center of the room stood an old wooden desk that James had never seen before. On the desk was an old typewriter, its keys clattering on their own, typing a message, "Get out." James stumbled back, his flashlight falling from his grip. The typewriter continued its relentless typing, the words now echoing in his head. He turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He was trapped. Desperation clawed at him as he pounded on the door, screaming for help. But no one could hear him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. A cold hand grasped his shoulder, and he turned, coming face to face with the figure from the CCTV. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. Who are you?" James choked out. The figure leaned in close, its voice a chilling whisper. "I am the guardian of secrets. Those who dig too deep must pay the price." James's vision blurred as the coldness seeped into his bones. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The last thing he saw was the typewriter, its keys still clattering away, spelling out his fate. Weeks passed, and the morning staff found the security office empty, the cameras offline, and the CEO's office in disarray. James was never seen again. The night shift at Bracken and Finch remained vacant, and the once prestigious law firm fell into ruin. To this day, the building stands abandoned, a dark reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows. And some say if you listen closely on a rainy night, you can still hear the faint clatter of the typewriter, warning intruders to stay away.